The new album is In a Grove, which is an opera, music by you, of course, and some sound effects and other things that we'll talk about in collaboration with others. Maybe we can start with you talking a little bit about the genesis of this piece as an opera. It's based on a short story, yeah?
Yes. It really began probably just maybe a year after the completion of my first opera, Invisible Cities. And as you may or may not know, operas take a really long time to get off the ground. So the piece sort of was just, I remember my publisher, like a couple of months ago, he found my first draft for the piece, and it was so far from what eventually the opera became that it was sort of comical. It was before Stephanie signed onto the project, before Mary. It was just like, it was so, I think the other thing about it, it was very much basking in the heels of Invisible City. So I think it had some ideas that were probably closer to that opera. But the very first germinal idea I had was to adapt William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying into an opera, which has always been and remains one of my favorite books. But I think I realized that, first of all, the scope of the piece is too large, and also that it was just, not the right fit for my music. And so as a result, while researching the piece, I found that the structure of the book, which I loved, which is to say a series of stories told from different and contradictory perspectives, comes from Akutagawa's In a Grove, the short story, the very famous short story. And so, unlike probably 95% of people who are coming to this story, I did not come to it through the film Rashomon, and in fact sort of avoided it out of the fear of influence, and very much just wanted to work with this original text. So that was the very first germinal idea of the piece. I also knew that I didn't want to write another libretto. I wrote the libretto for Invisible Cities based on the novel by Calvino, and I just decided that I really wanted to collaborate with a librettist. At the end of the day, I'm not a writer. I'm a good condenser, but I'm not and I knew this piece was going to require significantly more alteration from the original story than I had intended with Invisible Cities. And so I met Stephanie. We were introduced by a mutual friend, a choreographer. I'm sorry, introduced by a mutual friend, a dramaturg named Corey Ellison, and she thought we would be good collaborators. And so I reached out so she rather introduced us. We met and we had a lot of overlapping sensibilities. I mean, I think the thing about the project is that everyone involved in it is a sort of, I'd say, I don't want to say reticent opera person, but a person whose backgrounds perhaps span more than just traditional opera, but also experimental theater and other works that are perhaps, and I think our idea for opera is all kind of collectively the dramatic setting of words on stage with music. And that was sort of my definition of opera, and it always has been, which is probably a good deal wider than some people's definition of opera. But anyway, so having had Stephanie with this similar background of both opera, but also experimental theater and also music, I think really was synergistic. And then so we, set upon the long path of making an opera happen, which it turns out is like really long, even if your first opera is successful, So, the first thing we sort of did was to just sketch out ideas of what the piece could be. We did a workshop in London, probably around 2017. We applied for and accepted to a workshop. So at that point, it was enough time to just start thinking about what it might be. And I wound up writing about 10 minutes of music, and Stephanie wound up writing a draft of the libretto, but it was really far from where the piece would eventually be. And eventually, through this workshop, through these commissions, through these conversations, we were able to sort of bring together some forces who would be the commissioning and producing forces, and those would be Pittsburgh Opera and LA Opera. Pittsburgh Opera being kind of the producing agent, and LA Opera being the commissioning agent for a co-production. And so that was a slow but steady process. The lovely people at Pittsburgh Opera signed on, needed a partner, and then we went. But it was really just like meeting after meeting after meeting, and finally the right people all came together. And the last piece of the puzzle was asking Mary Birnbaum to direct it, because she was another person who was strongly recommended to me. I got to know her, and she's again a person who has an experimental theater background. She actually trained as a mime, interestingly, and then came to opera directing as well. So we're all kind of insider outsiders in the opera world.
Yeah, and I notice, I mean, a lot of questions come to mind about the piece itself, but the framing of the piece, and you talk about it was attractive, the short story, the way that it was set up, and the way that you could translate it to the stage. I sense like a kind of still a Japanese aesthetic, kind of a kabuki style going on there.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily that. I would say that we moved it into America in terms of just thinking about like whose perspective are we speaking from, and what is our cultural reference point? And we all felt like a story of Japanese people made by a bunch of white people felt, not very aesthetically interesting. Right. But I think at the end of the day, it's that so much of the music I love is either Eastern or Eastern influenced. So whether it's gamelan, whether it's gagaku coming from Japan, whether it's as like Balinese gamelan, where this kind of focus on bells and interlocking rhythms and chiming, whether it's the show, another wonderful Japanese instrument, whether it's the sheng, which is this kind of Chinese equivalent, just all of these musics are really wonderful and really interesting to me. And then of course, on the Western side, so many composers whom I love, be it Debussy, Ravel, Mahler, Steve Reich, and so on, are all people who themselves were influenced by, and also the other kind of large influence on me is the Three Church Parables by Benjamin Britten, of which Curlew River is probably my favorite. Itself is an adaptation of a No drama, and so I think that there's both the influence of Eastern work on my music, which is very much prominent. I think especially with an emphasis on static harmonies or harmonies that stay the same. Then combining that with a lot of these composers who were themselves drawn to these kinds of traditions, it really does make for a piece that inevitably does flow out of this tradition, even if I'm not trying actively at any point to mimic or imitate Japanese or other kind of Asian musics.
Yeah. Well, I was put in mind of the Benjamin Britten piece that you mentioned, actually, in the structure of the opera.
Absolutely, it's one of my favorite. It's really that plus Bluebeard's Castle, and you have the structure.
Well, let's talk about the way that you write for the voice in this opera, and I've noticed in other vocal pieces of yours. I mean, it's very simple, and sometimes you have people singing, sort of on the same note, but there's a little bit of, there's a gesture that captures the ear. Like in this particular piece, that lowered seventh, you go down. Da, 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 da.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that is sticking in my head right now. It's so simple and so
yeah, and then of course it's inversion. It's da 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 da. The half step. It's the those two intervallic elements are extremely important for the piece. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can just talk about your approach to the voice a little bit. And you mentioned the librettist Stephanie Fleischman. And as a side note, I've known Corey Ellison for like 30 years now.
Oh, wow. That's so wild.
History going back. But how do you fit your vocal aesthetic with the words? What is that relationship like?
Yeah, I mean, I would be lying if it was like profoundly premeditated. I mean, I will say the thing about a lot of my work, and more than any other piece, I wrote this piece by singing it. I sang and recorded every single note into a digital audio workstation, Logic, and tuned it so it was audible, and palatable. But that really is how this piece was written. So I think for me, a lot of it is just like what felt naturally flowing, in a sense. It was very kind of precognitive. I wasn't writing a lot of it down. I really was just singing it. But yeah, I think that that has spun out, and if I had to guess, it would probably come from pop music more than anything else. Is this kind of spinning out of little motivic elements, little small fragments that sort of repeat and loop and evolve, and that's you know, I would be, yeah, I would be lying if I knew exactly where it came from, other than a lifetime of listening to music. But I have noticed that there's like, certainly in this piece, I was doing some very, very specific things in terms of, for example, the fifth scene with the outlaw. I'm trying to create a kind of dual character, you know, so that there's this kind of low monotone repeated note thing that is sort of declarative, speaking to an interlocutor tone, half steps, and then and that's in the bottom of his range, kind of, and then there's this more seductive tone, sort of middle and top of his range, which is lighter, almost quasi falsetto. And so what I was really trying to do a lot with this piece was, you know, elements of characterization. So I think I try to do a lot with a little, but I think and many times it's always linking back to the words. I'm always just trying to emphasize the words. But what's different with an opera as opposed to a kind of setting of a pre-existing text is that you are collaborating with a librettist. So I wound up, you know, Stephanie and I worked together so much that she would send me a draft. I would be like, I like this. Can you change this? And she'd come back to me with, you know, some yeses, some nos, and you know, and I was able to, you know, one of the big things with this piece is obviously repetition and the kind of repeating of ideas over and over again. And so as a result of that, you know, I asked very much for, you know, phrases to come back, thoughts to come back, and little by little, the piece is kind of like it has a circular form, and you wind up where you started. So I think that was a task where I could, once knowing phrases and phrases that set well and phrases that had a musical shape, or phrases that would then have a musical correlative, would then I'd ask for them to come back. And you know, I also found all these little things in the piece that wound up being these kinds of like I think every single scene repeats the opening phrase 3 times. I think it's kind of like I think of it as this kind of an incantation. It's not 100% true, but I think it's true in, you know, sort of 5 out of 6 times. That there was you know, each scene opens with that, and so that was not in the text, but then there are architectural things I built on top of what was existing from Stephanie, and then it becomes part of the text.
Yeah. I think the drum is an important part there. You hear that drum beat, whether it's in patterns of 2 or more or 3 or more.
Yeah, the bass drum, I was like the heartbeat of the whole piece.
Yeah, you can hear that very clearly. You mentioned the outlaw, and when I was listening to this piece, I got to the outlaw, and all of a sudden I heard this craftily placed distortion over his voice, right? Can you talk a little bit about how the vocal and how the opera itself was changed through digital use?
Yeah, and you know, so I think initially the idea for the piece was for the piece to be amplified and to have pre-recorded electronics, but not to have digital live processing, no live manipulation of the voices. And then at some point I was like, you know what, like, we're here, let's just do this. We got mics, let's take it to the next step. And so really what I wanted to do is, of course, create a sense of characterization that he is, you know, he's a bad hombre, to quote our former president. You know, so I think that, you know, that was obviously, but the other thing is that I wanted to create the sense of hazy memory that his mind has been his memory's fogged and distorted. And so I worked with this amazing programmer, Dave Sanchez, who I've been working with for probably 10 years at this point. And there's a song called Zanny by Billie Eilish, one of my favorite Billie Eilish songs. And the chorus, there's this bass drum that comes in and her voice gets distorted. And I was like, I want that. I want this to be in my opera. So I called him and I'm like, can you recreate this effect? And he's like, oh yeah, this is like amplitude modulation. And so, so yeah, that was sort of the first thing. And then there's this granulation effect, which is just kind of like sort of sound. And that's a sound I've worked with a lot. Another effect designed by Dave. And that was another kind of like, to me, that's like, you're in the dream, you're in the memory of the character, you know, when you are entering into their recollection, like the straightforward sort of telling of the story is, you know, the low monotone repeat, and this is high, it's got these kinds of effects on it, it's more swirling. And yeah, so again, like all of it is like ultimately all of it is ultimately in the service of telling the story, but you're working with such limited means dramatically. You're really telling a story in real time, and I think in general it's quite challenging, I find, to to keep interest, because the piece is incredibly focused. I want the listener like really radiating, it is static because when something changes, I want it to really register. And so it was just another tool in my toolbox of how to illuminate the emotional story of the characters.
Yeah. This is so different from what we think of in terms of opera. I mean, where do you see the future of this art form going? Because it has to go somewhere to remain relevant. I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but what do you see for the future of opera?
I mean, I think the future of opera is bright if the opera world is embracing of it. I think that unfortunately, I mean, first of all, it's having seen the sausage get made a little more, having seen the budgets for these productions, I am empathic with the challenges of doing this. It's really hard, especially in the US, where there's little to no state subsidy for this kind of stuff, like that, and particularly in the post-COVID era. So I really empathize with how challenging it is to run an opera company, and I don't mean to say anything that would not feel that way. And that being said, I do think that the Metropolitan Opera is correct in its embracing of contemporary works, as opposed to, I do think that we've hit a point, an inflection point where you can't just run repertory and expect it to work. But the other thing is you have to embrace technology. I remember speaking with a friend of mine, Mark Gray, who does sound design for a lot of operas, including John Adams, and I remember, and they were doing the staging of the wonderful Le Mot de Luan by the now unfortunately late Kaya Sariaho. And I was like, well, surely you're amplifying the singers here. I mean, you've got all these electronic sounds. And he's like, no, they've got they've got mics on them, but that's not what the institution wants. So I do think it has to embrace more things like amplification and electronics. There's this real, and also, I mean, the truth of the matter is that, especially singers in this day and age, they're so versatile. I mean, I sort of approached there was a lot of trepidation around how little vibrato was used in a grove initially. And the singers were all just fine with it because they've sung music theater, they've sung in churches, they've sung choirs. The flexibility of young singers is remarkable these days. So I think we need to encourage a variety of vocal techniques. I see pieces by, Meredith Monk, like Atlas is, this is, it was recently staged in LA by my friend and colleague, Yuval Sharon, who directed Invisible Cities. And, I'm like, this is opera, all of this is opera. I am not against any traditional opera to be even the slightest. I just think that there has to be stylistic and technological embracement for the field to go on, because, people say, why do they sing like this? And I say, well, because, to cut over, and I say, when I see Wagner, when I see someone singing, their tail off and huge voices with vibrato, I'm like, this makes sense. This dramatically makes sense. They've got to sing over 70, 80 orchestra musicians in a gigantic hall. And that's great, but we're in a hall of 50 people. So why do we need to sing this? And then I don't have an answer,
Yeah. Maybe we can finish out with you talking a little bit about your collaborators on this disc. You have some wonderful singers, and of course the Metropolis Ensemble, which you've worked with before.
Yes. It's really like a rogues gallery, I can never remember. Of all my favorite people in general. Many of the people who you've heard on prior albums are here, particularly Lindsay Kesselman, who's just, absolutely, and I have to say that she has an incredible voice, and it's a low part for a soprano for the most part. There's a couple of really high notes, but it's mostly low, and everyone's like, this is a mezzo part, this is a mezzo part. And I'm like, no, this is a soprano part, emphasizing the lower part of her range because she's in an emotionally fragile state. So Lindsay, absolutely amazing. Taylor Ward was recommended to me by a colleague because I was like, I need this really specific kind of light voiced baritone who's also has a really low voice, who also has a really high voice, who can sing with no vibrato. And He was recommended to me, and he just done an amazing job. I mean, he was really did amazing. And then the two other singers in the production were actually in the premiere. Chuanyuan Liu, it's just a kind of unearthly countertenor, and who really has such a beautiful voice, tried so hard, and was so collaborative and helpful with me on the piece. I really think he's a really amazing singer. And then Andrew Turner, was also in the premiere, really great young tenor, just now doing on the third or fourth degree at Juilliard. And just again, perfect for the voice, such a sweet, almost, he brings such a great naivete to the character that is very important to him, but also the unearthly darkness. So that the singers are just amazing. Metropolis Ensemble is a group I've been working with for over 10 years now. And when I pitched the project to Andrew Cyr, the artistic director, I was like, okay, this is crazy, but like, I think we should multi-track the whole thing, because we had gone so far out of our way in COVID to learn how to learn all these new technologies where everyone's recording from home, et cetera. And I was like, you know what? I want to use this, but not because we have to, but because we can make something totally different and amazing. And so, and Andrew was like, you know what? I just did this Tiny Braxton album. That's exactly how we did it. I love this idea. And I was like, wow, that was an easier pitch than I expected. But Metropolis had also been around helping to develop the work for a long time. So it all just made tons of sense. So, got the go ahead from Andrew, some really amazing supporters, all jumped on board. And, and we brought in some of our real hired guns, Ian Rosenbaum, percussionist, who played both the percussion parts in this piece, who's, basically plays everything I write. And David Kaplan, Clara Kim, all, Mike Avatabile, all close collaborators of mine who happen to be also members of the group. So it was just total slam dunk in terms of being able to work with all these really, really great people.
Yeah. Well, what I love about the recording of this is it makes me really want to experience it live in the theater, because there are so many. It's an interesting story, first of all, and second of all, there are a lot of dramatic cues in the score that I would love to experience in person. And just listening to it, like I said earlier, those little turns of phrase. You have a way of making music out of very simple means, and I think that really translates well, especially for this story, but also just in opera in general. So,
well, yeah, and when we did it live, the very end of the piece, it resolves to this very low G, and when I was writing on the piano, I was like, and I hit the G below the lowest G on the piano, and I was like, wait a minute, I've run out of range here. And so I put an electronic sampler where I pitched a double bass note down to that low G. And then, we were doing it live, and I was like, this isn't cutting it, guys. So they go out and get a subwoofer. And so when you see it live, the room shakes at the end. It's really immersive as an experience. And so, I mean, if you have a good subwoofer, it'll work with the record too, but just absolutely. I mean, I think this is meant to ultimately, I love the record. I'm really proud of it. It's the kind of sonic ideal, but I also think it's meant to be seen live because it is an opera.
Yeah, well, it's been out for a little over a week now, or about a week now, from Inner Circle Records. The opera In a Grove by Christopher Cerrone, who has joined us to talk about it a little bit today. I'll be sure and link all the information where people can find more information about the opera and about you. But thanks so much for chatting about it.
My pleasure. Great to see you as always.